And we have with us from Prague, Czech Republic, Galeotti, who is the one of the best expert on Russian security, on transatlantic international organized crime and intelligence, and who is closely following what's happening in Russia these days. So, Mark, thanks a lot for being with us. And, we are following what you're writing for the last 2 years, especially during the time of escalation. There is very little, let's say, security and military analysis. We knew how it was, when there are different kind of the open warfare. But currently, especially with the accusation of the Federal Security Service of Russia against Ukraine on this using the alleged terrorist attacks and plots, how can you describe this strategy? What is your take on that? How we can understand this type of the actions of the Russian Security Service, which are supported by the quotes of the Russian leadership?
Well, I very much describe this as a strategy of tension. This is not so much about preparing for military action. It is essentially about political warfare, ratcheting up the tension, because when it comes down to it, after all, Putin has very, very few real meaningful instruments when it comes to not just affecting Ukraine, but also, we must remember, we're coming up to the Normandy discussions, also the West's response to Ukraine. Pretty much Putin's only meaningful instrument he's got is to say, yes, things are bad now, but I could make them even worse. So this is, I think, primarily what he's doing. He's building up the strategy of tension. The trouble is, given just how volatile, not just Crimea, but also the line of contact in the Donbass is, given the extent to which you have all kinds of different security structures, military structures, and, let's face it, militias that are nothing less than warlords, when you create that kind of tension, which means you have a lot of people with fingers near the triggers, then the risk of it escalating into some kind of open conflict becomes all the greater. But I don't think that's the intent. I think the intent is basically political warfare by these rather sort of characteristically Russian means.
How typical is this kind of the tactics for the recent Russian security services? In particular, there are proliferation of a lot of video files. We can't sometimes confirm how genuine they are. A lot of people are giving testimonies, the Ukrainian citizens, that they were really trying to do something in Crimea. How do you see what is this particular tactic from the security service, so what is your really thoughts about that?
Well, for me, this is very much evidence that the Russian security services have halfway made their way into the modern age. If we look back to their history, one of the classic techniques of the old Soviet security structures was the completely staged confession, in which someone is beaten, brutalized, tortured, intimidated into agreeing that, yes, they were a foreign spy or wanted to assassinate Stalin or whatever. And in some ways, what they're trying to do is very much move that into the modern age. And so you'll instead have video clips and such like. So they have adapted in that respect. What they haven't adapted to, though, is the way in which actually the modern world is one in which, in some ways, the capacity to engage with this kind of propaganda has been democratized. You have people all around the world who, when these sort of clips come out, really start trying to deconstruct them, look into the details. For example, the most famous one of the recent batch was one particular piece of Russian propaganda that showed a full moon. And so people just simply thought, okay, let's just check. When was the last full moon? And realized that, in fact, the dates didn't possibly match up. So what happens is, time and time again, the Russians are getting trapped. They're trying to come up with glitchy video evidence and so forth to prove their propaganda, but they're really not up to actually making it proof against the thousands, millions of people around the world who then want to try and actually see if it's propaganda or not. So very much a half-successful attempt to move old strategies into the video age.
But still, when you talk to the colleagues, to the expert community, do you think how credible it is? Because when I was given different kind of comments and debates, including with the Russian journalists for the international media, I've heard that point by the Western commentators that there is no smoke without fire, which probably we thought would be really actual, before the Crimean invasion, but not today. Though I still hear these voices, so how credible is still the Kremlin is if you speak about the larger community? Because it's not everybody and not every media which is ready to debunk and fact check.
Yes, I mean, this is the pernicious thing about it. In some ways, you make one lie and it's a lie. You repeat that lie 100 times and people begin to wonder, oh, well, I wonder if there's some truth in it. In reality, if we look at the evidence, the impact of Russia's propaganda war has not been so much to convince many people that the Russians are right, so much as to create an illusion that, oh, well, we'll never know the truth. And we've seen that, for example, with the MH17 shootdown, where actually the facts really are quite devastatingly clear. And yet precisely because the Russians have now for years been launching this attempt to throw out all kinds of, often frankly ludicrous, propaganda claims, not necessarily to convince, but just to try and convince people that there is no objective truth, that they'll never really know. That's the most pernicious thing about it. So yes, I mean, I wouldn't want to say for a moment that Russian propaganda isn't successful, but we have to realize at what is it successful? It's not so much at convincing people of anything, it's at convincing people that in a way there is no truth, and that therefore it doesn't really matter.
Mark, and still coming back, because though we see, and you said it's a lot about the political tension, we know that there is more, Russian troops in Crimea. There is a kind of the real escalation on the contact line compared to, like the calmer times. So really from that point of view, what should be we aware? We understand that there is a very specific terrain of the Crimean Peninsula. It's very thin, and still I hear the discussion on the international media, could there be Ukrainian, the direct confrontation between the Ukrainian army and the Russian army, in particular in that area. And also with the time that there was some kind of strengthening the separation lines by the Ukrainian forces had been done. So how do you see that? Like really how we can speak about the situation from the military point of view?
Let's separate what's going on in the Crimea from what's going on in the Donbass. First of all, in the Crimea, yes, there is a strengthening of Russia's military positions. In part, though, this is actually about a rotation of forces. The natural cycle of the Russian military, like any conscript-heavy military force, is that they actually have to have regular rotations of forces. So this is both a beefing up of forces and a rotation. But in any case, exactly as you said, the geography of the Crimea makes actually, just as it would be very hard for Ukrainian forces to take the Crimea back militarily, so too it's not at all the best way in which you try and surge forces into Ukraine. Most importantly, though, look, 2 years ago, Russia had a chance, if it had decided to devote the kind of forces and the political will to, for example, drive its way through to build a land bridge to Crimea from Russian-held territory. That might have been possible when the Ukrainian military was essentially in totally demoralized and disorganized state. We've got to actually appreciate that although there's still a lot of ground to be made up, nonetheless, the Ukrainian military is now in a much, much stronger position than it was in the past. And the Russians haven't sent the kind of numbers of extra troops they would have to actually be able to make a difference there. So there's very little evidence there's some plans for some kind of major offensive. On the other hand, if you look at the Donbass, there has been a build-up of some Russian forces there. And there's also been increasing violence. Now, in part, that's seasonal. This is campaign season. Summer is basically when the fighting happens. And we see this each year. So you can in part explain that. You can also in part explain that as basically being because of the initiative of the local militia commanders, who, let's realize this, they are on the whole thugs, warlords and criminal entrepreneurs. If you start some fighting, you can basically then get from the Russians ammunition and equipment to make up with what you've expended. And then often what they then do is sell a lot of that and make money off it. So in a way, fighting becomes a money-making venture for them. So they have an encouragement, a reason to continue that. But there is one third element. Again, I think this is part of, as I said, the strategy of tension. That Russia wants to keep Ukraine guessing. Russia wants Ukraine to be thinking, is there going to be an offensive next Tuesday or not? The longer they can do that, Moscow's thinking, and I think it's wrong, but nonetheless Moscow's thinking is that essentially this is what will drive Kiev to make some kind of a deal on terms that Russia is happy with, and also that in due course the West will just get tired of supporting Kiev. So yes, there's a surge up of forces, but there's actually very little evidence of a plan for a serious major military offensive. It's more just a slow ratcheting up of the low-level violence for political purposes.
We also heard this, and this was all sometimes the part of the Russian tactics, like it was in Georgia in 2008. People were thinking about Abkhazia because the escalation was there, but the assault was regarding South Ossetia. But if to think not just about that, within these last 2 years, how the Russian military had changed. You know, you mentioned, and we know that there was a strengthening of the Ukrainian army, especially on the borderline with Russia. You know, there are some change in NATO, in the Baltics, not that huge, but still. And so what is the upgrade of the Russian military?
It's continuing to improve, although a lot less quickly these days because of economic problems. And therefore they put money into trying to recruit more professional soldiers. They've just reached the point where there are now more professional soldiers than conscripts within the Russian military. They've spent money on more equipment and so forth. But you've got to realize just how large the Russian army is, and actually how far they've still got to go. Roughly speaking, about a third of the Russian military has been brought up to relatively modern standards, not absolute top of the line. They're not the equivalent of American or British troops. But nonetheless, they're at decent strength. But that's just a third. 2/3 is still much, much less effectively reformed. Now, in order to maintain their battalion combat groups in the Donbass, they've only taken those forces from professionals, and therefore it's a disproportionate number. So they're having to draw professional units from all around the country to go into the Donbass when they do. That's creating a certain degree of stress. They've also now got operations taking place in Syria, which is taking the best of their pilots, which is not directly a sort of a factor for Ukraine because the Russians haven't been using air power in this war. But nonetheless, I think we are seeing a military which is capable but doesn't have a huge amount of surge capability. They can move forces quickly. We saw that they can muster 20, 30, 40,000 troops quite quickly, which is no small matter. But these days, that is not the kind of size of a force you would need to be able to maintain a full-scale war against Ukraine. So I think, yes, the Russian military has improved, and it is slowly continuing to improve, but we shouldn't get too taken up with that. There is still much, much to be done, and in some ways, it's a classic Russian thing. They put much of their force improvement capability into the teeth, the fighting arms, the guns, the tanks, the bombs. And what they've neglected is the tail, the logistics, making sure that people are going to be refueled and rearmed and re-equipped in time. And that actually is critical for a serious war. It's logistics. It's this kind of stuff which actually wins wars. And this is one reason why when they have deployed forces into the Donbass, usually in response to Ukrainian military successes, they've been short, very, very high-intensity military attacks that the Russians have launched. And in part it's short because that's their style, blitzkrieg, but it's also because they literally start running out of ammunition. Now, if they can run out of ammunition after a 2-3 day little small-scale blitz, just think what would happen if they tried a full-scale war.
And Mark, of course, we as well keeping eye on the reshuffle in the Kremlin. So there is a new head of the present administration instead of old fellow Sergei Ivanov. There is a very unknown person who Anton Vaina, who was responsible for the Putin protocols. People are, the experts we talked in Russia say that it's about strengthening the personal power of Vladimir Putin, and also the fact that it's more about him himself running the country rather than, let's say, a group of the people known as siloviki. So what is your idea about that, and on what it could influence this kind of, what is the impact, possible impact of these changes in the Russian, let's say, as well, leadership?
Yes, well, I think I very much interpret that this reshuffle within the leadership as being part of a process whereby Putin is trying to get, in a way, a new generation, in some ways the team for his next presidential term after 2018. He's very much going for younger people, and he's recruiting from people he knows. Bodyguards, protocol advisors, people in his chancellery, that kind of thing, or friends and friends, clients of friends. That's how he did it in the past. But in a way, he had different groups of people he knew in the past. In the past, it was people he'd been in the KGB with, people he'd been in St. Petersburg with. Now it's people who are in his kind of Moscow sphere of clients. I don't think it makes a huge difference. The interesting thing about Ivanov is that, he made the presidential administration incredibly powerful. And on one hand, it was a very powerful instrument for Putin to exert his will on the country. I would say the presidential administration is the single most important institution in all of Russia. But also, in some ways, the presidential administration became the prison around Putin, because it got to decide most of the information that actually reached the president's desk. And Ivanov, some people say he was very hawkish on Ukraine, some people not so. It's very hard to be sure. What we do know is that Ivanov had an incredibly conspiratorial view of the world. As far as he was concerned, the West, the outside world, was out to get Russia, and there were all these plots and so forth, which is, let's face it, also probably Putin's mindset. But so in this respect, Putin and Ivanov played off each other and regenerated. We don't know what Vaino is going to be like. We don't know if he's in the same conspiratorial mindset. He's certainly going to be at the moment at least, much less powerful a figure. So what this might mean is that just Putin gets to decide policy entirely on his own. That's possible. It also could mean that we actually have some different voices, different perspectives coming in. We don't really know for certain. But in essence, this is not, I think, going to have a major impact now or this year. We're talking about really the sort of a whole shift in the elite that's going to be important over the next 5-10 years.
So, Mark, thanks a lot for that profound analysis, and we are following the story and trying to get all the details for you.